The chains bit into Ruby Preston's skin as she watched the dust devil dance across the barren Arizona landscape. Dusk painted the vast sky in violent hues of red and purple, but the beauty was lost on her as the metal cuffs cut deeper into her wrists with each frantic tug. 3 days she'd been left here, staked to the unforgiving earth, her supplies gone and hope dwindling as fast as her water had. The year was 1878, and the promise of a new life had led Ruby to venture west after her parents' passing left her with nothing but debts and painful memories in Boston. At 22, she had scraped together enough to join a wagon train bound for California, dreaming of a seamstress shop of her own. She never imagined she'd end up abandoned in the desert, betrayed by the very people who had promised her safe passage. "You ain't worth the trouble," Silas Crawley had spat before riding off with the others, leaving her chained to an iron stake driven deep into the hard earth. Their wagon train had been small to begin with, just 4 wagons and 11 people. When Apache raiders attacked 3 days back, killing 2 men and sending the others fleeing in all directions, Silas had gathered what remained of their party. In the chaos, Ruby had witnessed him pocket valuables from the dead. When she confronted him, his smile had turned cold. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her heart racing. Apache returning to finish what they started? Crawley and his men coming back to silence her permanently? Ruby twisted against her bonds, the metal slicing deeper as blood trickled down her wrists. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the dying sun. As he drew closer, she could make out a tall man atop a chestnut stallion. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring his features, and a duster coat that billowed behind him like wings. "Help!" Ruby's voice emerged as a croak, her throat parched from thirst and screaming. "Please." The rider slowed, then dismounted in one fluid motion. As he approached, she saw a face weathered by sun and wind, but not unkind. Deep-set eyes studied her with a mix of concern and caution. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal sandy hair streaked with gold. "Looks like you've had yourself some trouble." "Please," Ruby whispered, tears cutting trails through the dust on her cheeks. "They left me to die." The stranger knelt beside her, examining the chains with calloused hands. "Name's Wade Xander," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Most folks just call me Wade." "Ruby Preston," she managed, her voice breaking. "I don't have anything to offer you, but please," Wade shook his head. "Don't need payment to help someone in need, Miss Preston." He ran his fingers along the chains, assessing them. "These are sturdy. Got any water left?" Ruby shook her head, watching as he retrieved a canteen from his horse. He held it to her lips, and she drank greedily, some of the precious liquid spilling down her chin. "Easy now," he cautioned. "Too much too fast will make you sick." After she'd had her fill, Wade examined the chains again. "I'm going to need to break these," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "It'll make some noise. Could draw attention." "There's no one for miles," Ruby said. "At least, no one who cares whether I live or die." Wade nodded grimly, returning to his horse. He came back with a leather pouch from which he drew several tools. For several minutes, he worked at the lock with a tension wrench and pick, but the mechanism was rusted and wouldn't budge. "Damn thing's seized up," he muttered, pocketing his tools. "Only one way to do this now." He stood, stretching his fingers and rolling his shoulders. "These chains are old, and that rust might work in our favor. But this is going to hurt me a fair bit, and it might hurt you too if the chain snaps back wrong." Ruby nodded, ready for anything that might free her from this death sentence. Wade positioned himself, wrapping the chain around his hands several times. His knuckles whitened as he took a deep breath, muscles tensing beneath his shirt. With a grunt that evolved into a primal roar, he pulled, feet digging into the earth for leverage. Nothing happened at first. Wade's face reddened with exertion, veins standing out on his neck and forehead. Then came a metallic groan as decades-old iron began to protest. Ruby held her breath, hardly daring to hope. With one final, tremendous effort, Wade twisted and pulled. There was a sharp crack as a link gave way, followed by the clatter of chain falling to the ground. The force sent Wade stumbling backward, but he regained his footing quickly. Ruby stared in disbelief at her freed hands, still encircled by metal cuffs but no longer bound to the earth. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." Wade was examining his hands, which were bleeding in several places where the chain had cut into his skin. "Let's get those cuffs off you proper," he said, brushing aside her concern with a nod. "Then we need to move. Whoever did this might come back to check their handiwork." It took several more minutes with a small file from his pouch before the cuffs fell away, revealing angry red welts circling Ruby's wrists. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her after days of limited movement. Without hesitation, Wade scooped her into his arms. "I've got you, Miss Preston," he said, his voice gentle despite its roughness. "Let's get you to safety." He carried her to his horse, setting her carefully in the saddle before mounting behind her. Ruby's head swam with relief and exhaustion as she leaned back against his solid chest. "Thank you," she murmured as consciousness began to slip away. "I thought I was going to die out here." Wade's arm tightened protectively around her waist. "Not while I'm around," he promised, urging his horse forward into the gathering darkness. "You're safe now." Ruby awoke to the crackling of a small fire and the smell of coffee brewing. She was wrapped in a blanket, lying on a bedroll beneath a rocky overhang. The night sky stretched endlessly above, studded with more stars than she'd ever seen in Boston. Wade sat on the other side of the fire, wrapping strips of cloth around his injured hands. He looked up when she stirred, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "How long was I asleep?" Ruby asked, her voice still rough. "Few hours," Wade replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "Sun'll be up in another hour or so." He extended the cup toward her. "Think you can sit up for this?" Ruby pushed herself upright, muscles protesting after days of abuse. She accepted the cup gratefully, savoring the warmth between her palms before taking a careful sip. The bitter liquid revived her further. "Why did you help me?" she asked after a moment of silence. "Most men would have ridden on by." Wade considered her question as he poured his own coffee. "My pa taught me that a man's measured by what he does when no one's watching." He shrugged. "Besides, leaving a woman to die in the desert ain't something I could live with." Ruby studied him in the firelight. His face was all planes and angles, a small scar running along his jaw. His eyes, she now saw, were a clear blue-gray like the sky after a storm. "Where are we headed?" she asked. "Place called Copper Creek, about 2 days' ride from here. Small mining town where I've got some business." Wade met her gaze across the fire. "If that doesn't suit you, I can take you elsewhere once you're stronger." Ruby had no plan beyond survival. "Copper Creek sounds fine," she said. "I'll need to find work, though. I was headed to California to open a seamstress shop, but..." She gestured helplessly at her tattered dress. "Copper Creek's growing," Wade offered. "Might be looking for someone with needle skills." He hesitated. "Mind telling me how you ended up chained in the middle of nowhere?" Ruby's hand tightened around her cup as she recounted the attack, Silas Crawley's theft, and her abandonment when she threatened to expose him. "Crawley," Wade repeated, his expression darkening. "Heavy-set fella with a beard and a scar through his left eyebrow?" Ruby nodded, surprised. "You know him?" "Know of him," Wade corrected grimly. "He's made a habit of robbing folks who hire him as a guide. Usually just leaves them stranded, though. This is new, even for him." He studied her curiously. "What did you see that made him resort to chains?" "He killed one of our own party," Ruby said quietly. "Martin Walsh. Martin survived the Apache attack, but was injured. While everyone was distracted, Crawley smothered him with a blanket, then took his gold watch and the money pouch sewn into his jacket. Wade whistled low. That'd do it. Crawley's a thief and a coward, but murder raises the stakes. He set down his cup. You should rest more. We'll head out at first light. Ruby wanted to protest, but exhaustion pulled at her limbs. What about you? I'll keep watch, he said simply. Sleep. You're safe now. As Ruby drifted back to sleep, she found herself believing him. The journey to Copper Creek was slow going. Ruby's strength returned gradually with regular meals and water, but the ordeal had taken its toll. Wade proved to be a patient companion, setting an easy pace and stopping whenever she needed rest. During their second day of travel, as they picked their way through a pine-covered mountain pass, Ruby broke the comfortable silence. You never said what your business is in Copper Creek. Wade's expression remained neutral. I track people. Some call me a bounty hunter, but that ain't quite right. I find folks who don't want to be found, sometimes bringing them back, sometimes just bringing word of where they are. And who are you tracking now? Ruby asked. A muscle tightened in Wade's jaw. Man named Fletcher. Robbed a bank in Tucson, shot 2 people dead. One was a 12-year-old boy who was just standing in line with his mother. The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down Ruby's spine. That's terrible. Word is Fletcher's holed up somewhere near Copper Creek. Been tracking him for 3 weeks now. Wade adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun. What about you? What brought you west from Boston? Ruby told him about her parents, her father's gambling debts, and her mother's illness, and how their deaths had left her with nothing but their unpaid loans and her sewing skills. I sold everything to pay what I could and buy passage west, she explained. I had just enough left to start over. Maybe open a small shop somewhere people need a seamstress. Brave thing, heading west alone, Wade commented. Ruby laughed without humor. Or foolish. Look where it got me. Alive, Wade countered. That counts for something in these parts. They crested a ridge just before sunset on the second day, and Wade reined in his horse. Below them stretched a valley, nestled between towering peaks. A cluster of buildings hugged a creek that glinted like molten copper in the dying light. Copper Creek, Wade announced. Not much to look at, but it's growing. Gold and copper strikes have been drawing folks for the past year. Ruby took in the town a main street with perhaps 24 buildings, surrounded by tents and rough cabins scattered across the valley floor. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance, she could make out people moving about. It looks. She searched for the right word. Alive. Wade nodded. That it is. Let's find you a proper bed for the night. The main street of Copper Creek was muddy from recent rain, forcing Wade to guide his horse carefully between puddles. Lanterns glowed in windows, and a piano tinkled from the saloon. Several people called greetings to Wade as they passed, which he returned with nods or brief words. You're known here, Ruby observed. Passed through a few times, he replied. Small towns have long memories. They stopped outside a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign reading Copper Creek Hotel. Wade dismounted first, then helped Ruby down. Her legs had grown stronger, but she still held onto his arms for support longer than strictly necessary. The hotel's proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Abernathy, greeted Wade like an old friend before turning curious eyes on Ruby. This is Miss Preston, Wade explained. She needs a room and some looking after. Had a rough journey. Mrs. Abernathy's gaze swept over Ruby's tattered dress and bandaged wrists, but she asked no questions. Room 3's available. Has a nice view of the mountains. I don't have much money, Ruby admitted, color rising in her cheeks. First night's on me, Wade said firmly. After that, we'll figure something out. Before Ruby could protest, he paid Mrs. Abernathy, who promptly called for hot water to be brought up for a bath. Ruby found herself ushered upstairs to a small but clean room with a real bed, the first she'd seen in weeks. I'll be at the saloon if you need anything, Wade told her. Get some rest. Wait. Ruby caught his arm. I don't know how to thank you. For everything. Something flickered in Wade's eyes, something warm that made Ruby's heart beat faster. No thanks needed, he said gruffly. Just doing what's right. After he left, Ruby sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by all that had happened. 3 days ago, she had been preparing to die, abandoned and alone. Now she sat in a hotel room, alive because a stranger had stopped to help when he could have ridden on. The hot bath was a luxury beyond measure. Ruby scrubbed away days of dirt and fear, watching the water turn murky. Mrs. Abernathy had provided a simple nightgown and promised to find her some proper clothes in the morning. Clean and exhausted, Ruby fell into a dreamless sleep for the first time since leaving Boston. The next morning brought sunshine streaming through her window and the sounds of a town coming to life. Ruby, dressed in the clothes Mrs. Abernathy had left, a simple blue dress that was a bit loose but serviceable, and made her way downstairs. Wade sat at a table in the small dining room, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up when she entered, his eyes widening slightly before he controlled his expression. "Morning," he said, rising to pull out a chair for her. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," Ruby admitted, taking the offered seat. "Thank you again for the room." Wade waved away her thanks. "Figured you'd want to clean up proper before facing the town." He pushed a plate of eggs and biscuits toward her. "Eat. We've got some ground to cover today." As they ate, Wade explained his plan. "I need to ask around about Fletcher, but first, I want to help you get settled. Town's got a seamstress, but she's old and her eyes are failing. Might be willing to take on help or even sell her business to the right person." Ruby stared at him. "You've already looked into this?" "Asked Mrs. Abernathy this morning," he said with a shrug. "Small towns, remember? Everyone knows everyone's business." After breakfast, they walked down the main street. Copper Creek was more impressive by daylight, newer buildings mixed with hastily constructed structures, all humming with activity. A mining town in its early boom days, flush with optimism and opportunity. The seamstress shop was tucked between the general store and a barber shop. A bell tinkled as they entered, and an elderly woman looked up from her work, squinting at them through thick spectacles. "Mrs. Turner," Wade greeted her, removing his hat. "Brought someone you might want to meet." The old woman peered at Ruby. "Come closer, girl. These eyes don't work like they used to." Ruby stepped forward, and Mrs. Turner reached out, her fingers surprisingly strong as they grasped Ruby's hands. "Seamstress hands," she declared after a moment. "You've worked with needle and thread for years." "Since I was a child," Ruby confirmed. "My mother taught me." For the next hour, Mrs. Turner questioned Ruby about fabrics, stitches, and techniques. Wade excused himself to make inquiries about Fletcher, leaving the women to their discussion. By the time he returned, Ruby was seated at a sewing machine, demonstrating her skill by repairing a torn shirt with neat, even stitches. Mrs. Turner watched with undisguised approval. "Well?" Wade asked from the doorway. Mrs. Turner snorted. "Well, what? She's hired, of course. Girl knows her stuff, and these old hands won't last forever." She turned to Ruby. "Room in the back you can use. Not fancy, but it's clean. $5 a week plus room and board until I decide if you're worth more." Ruby's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. I won't disappoint you." Wade smiled, the first genuine smile Ruby had seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Told you it'd work out." Outside, Ruby could barely contain her excitement. "I can't believe it. A job, a place to stay, Wade. How can I ever repay you?" "Seeing you smile is payment enough," he said, looking embarrassed as soon as the words left his mouth. He cleared his throat. "I've got some leads on Fletcher. Need to follow up on them." Ruby's happiness dimmed slightly. "Will you be leaving town?" "Not yet," he assured her. Fletcher's close. I can feel it, but I won't find him today. He hesitated. Would you? That is, would you care to have dinner tonight? To celebrate your new position. A warm flutter spread through Ruby's chest. I'd like that very much. That evening, Wade escorted Ruby to the town's only restaurant, a modest establishment called the Silver Fork. They were shown to a corner table with a checkered cloth and a small vase containing wildflowers. Fancy for Copper Creek, Wade commented as they sat down. Ruby smoothed her borrowed dress nervously. I feel underdressed. You look beautiful, Wade said quietly, then flushed. I mean, you look fine. More than fine. Ruby felt her own cheeks warm. Thank you. Conversation flowed more easily as they ate. Wade told her about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, losing his parents to fever when he was 18, and drifting west afterward. Ruby shared stories of Boston, of dreams deferred and hopes that had never died, even in her darkest moments chained in the desert. What will you do after you find Fletcher? She asked as they lingered over apple pie. Wade considered the question. There's always someone else to track. Someone who needs finding, for good reasons or bad. He studied his coffee. Never thought much beyond the next job. No place you call home? Not for a long time. His eyes met hers. What about you? Is Copper Creek just a stop on the way to California? Ruby had been thinking about that all day. I think I could be happy here. It's a growing town, needs a good seamstress. And I like Mrs. Turner. She traced the pattern on the tablecloth. Besides, I'm not eager to travel again so soon. Wade nodded, understanding in his gaze. As they walked back to Mrs. Turner's shop in the soft evening light, their hands brushed occasionally, sending sparks up Ruby's arm. At the door, they paused. Thank you for dinner, Ruby said softly. And for everything else. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me. Wade stepped closer, his voice low. I'm glad I did. For a moment, Ruby thought he might kiss her. Instead, he took her hand gently, mindful of her still healing wrists, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Good night, Ruby Preston. Good night, Wade Xander, she whispered, watching him walk away into the gathering darkness. The following days established a routine. Ruby worked in Mrs. Turner's shop, quickly proving her worth as customers praised her fine stitching and eye for detail. Wade came and went, following leads on Fletcher, but always returned to Copper Creek by nightfall. They shared meals when possible, each one revealing more about the other. Ruby found herself looking forward to these times, to the sound of Wade's voice and the rare occasions when he laughed a rich, rusty sound as if unpracticed. On her fourth night in town, Ruby was closing the shop when Wade appeared at the door, his expression grim. What's wrong? She asked immediately. Fletcher's closer than I thought, he replied, stepping inside and locking the door behind him. Got word he's hiding at an abandoned mine about 5 miles north. Planning to rob the payroll coach when it comes through tomorrow. Ruby's hand flew to her throat. Are you going after him tonight? Wade shook his head. Too dangerous in the dark. Cave systems up there are treacherous. His eyes held hers. But I will go at first light. Wanted you to know, in case. In case you don't come back, Ruby finished for him, her voice hardly more than a whisper. Wade moved closer, his calloused fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. I'll come back, he promised. But this man's dangerous. Cornered men usually are. Ruby clutched his hand, pressing it against her cheek. Be careful. Something broke in Wade's careful reserve. He pulled her gently into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that started soft but quickly deepened with an urgency that left them both breathless. I've wanted to do that since I found you in the desert, he murmured against her hair. Ruby clung to him, memorizing the feel of his arms around her, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. Come back to me, she whispered. Please come back. Wade kissed her again, a promise sealed without words. Then he was gone, slipping into the night like a shadow. Ruby barely slept, tossing and turning as she imagined all manner of terrible outcomes. At dawn, she gave up trying and dressed for the day, though the shop wouldn't open for hours yet. Mrs. Turner found her organizing thread by color for the third time. "Won't make him any safer. Worrying yourself sick," the old woman observed shrewdly. Ruby jumped. "I don't know what you mean." Mrs. Turner snorted. "Girl, I'm old, not blind. You think I haven't seen the way you two look at each other?" She patted Ruby's hand. "He's good with that gun of his. Smart, too. He'll be back." The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Ruby helped customers mechanically, her ears straining for any news from the north. By late afternoon, her nerves were stretched to breaking. When the bell above the door jingled, Ruby looked up from her sewing machine, hope flaring in her chest only to have it extinguished when she saw not Wade, but a round-faced deputy. "Miss Preston?" he asked, twisting his hat in his hands. "Sheriff asks if you could come to the office. It's about Wade Xander." Ruby's heart plummeted. "Is he?" "Just come, miss. Please." The walk to the sheriff's office was the longest of Ruby's life. Each step felt like moving through molasses, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. Sheriff Davis, a weathered man with iron-gray hair, looked up as she entered. "Miss Preston, thank you for coming." "Where is he?" Ruby demanded, her voice unsteady. "What's happened to Wade?" The door to the back room opened, and Wade stepped through, a bandage visible beneath his torn shirt and a fresh cut above his eyebrow, but gloriously, wonderfully alive. Ruby crossed the room in 3 quick strides and threw herself into his arms, uncaring of propriety or the amused looks exchanged by the sheriff and his deputy. Wade winced slightly, but held her tight. "Told you I'd come back," he murmured into her hair. Sheriff Davis cleared his throat. "Miss Preston, Mr. Xander here tracked Fletcher to that abandoned mine, just like he thought. Confronted him alone, which was damn foolish." He shot Wade a disapproving look. "But he managed to bring him in. Fletcher's locked up tight, waiting for the marshal to transport him to Tucson." Ruby pulled back enough to look at Wade's face. "You're hurt." "Flesh wound," he dismissed. "Fletcher got lucky with his knife before I disarmed him." "Flesh wound that needed 15 stitches, Sheriff Davis corrected dryly. "Doc says he's lucky it wasn't deeper." Ruby's hands fluttered over Wade's chest, afraid to touch and cause more pain. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," Wade said simply. "And Fletcher won't hurt anyone else." Sheriff Davis stood, reaching for his hat. "I'll leave you two be. Wade, remember what Doc said about rest." With a knowing smile, he ushered his deputy out, leaving them alone. Ruby carefully helped Wade to a chair, her hands still trembling with relief and residual fear. "Don't ever scare me like that again." Wade caught her hand, drawing her closer until she was standing between his knees. "Can't promise that," he said honestly. "But I can promise I'll always do my best to come back to you." Her breath caught at the implications of his words. "To me?" "Been thinking," Wade said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Maybe it's time I stopped drifting. Found somewhere to call home." His blue-gray eyes held hers. "Someone to come home to." Ruby's heart soared. "What are you saying, Wade Xander?" "I'm saying I know it's fast. We've known each other less than 2 weeks." He took a deep breath. "But I knew the moment I saw you in that desert that my life was changing. You're the bravest, strongest woman I've ever met, Ruby Preston. And if you'll have me, I'd like to stay in Copper Creek. With you." Ruby blinked back tears. "What about tracking? Finding people?" "Sheriff mentioned he could use a deputy who knows how to track," Wade said. "Said it would keep me closer to home." "To you." Ruby leaned down, pressing her forehead against his. "I think Mrs. Turner would be scandalized if I brought a man to live in her back room." Wade chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at his stitches. Wasn't suggesting that. At least, not yet. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small, worn velvet pouch. This was my mother's. Carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right woman. From the pouch, he tipped a simple gold band into his palm. It's soon, I know.
Too soon, maybe.
But life out here is uncertain. When you find something worth holding on to, you don't let it slip away. His eyes, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before, met hers. I'm not asking for tomorrow or next week. Just a promise that someday, when you're ready, you'll consider being my wife. Ruby cupped his face in her hands, tears spilling freely now. Wade Xander, I don't need someday. I've seen what life takes when you wait too long. She smiled through her tears.
Yes.
1,000 times yes. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, as if it had been made for her. Wade pulled her gently onto his lap, mindful of his wound, and kissed her with a tenderness that belied his strength, the same strength that had broken chains with bare hands and carried her to safety. I love you, Ruby Preston, he whispered against her lips. And I love you, Wade Xander, she replied, knowing with absolute certainty that she'd found not just safety, but home. 2 months later, Ruby stood before a mirror in Mrs. Turner's back room, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back at her. Gone was the desperate, half-starved woman in chains. In her place stood a bride in a dress of ivory silk that she'd sewn herself, her auburn hair arranged in soft curls beneath a simple veil. You look beautiful, child, Mrs. Turner said, adjusting the veil with careful fingers. He's a lucky man, your Wade. Ruby smiled, touching the small scar that remained on her wrist, a permanent reminder of what she'd survived. I'm the lucky one. The church was small but packed with townspeople who had embraced both Ruby and Wade as their own. Sheriff Davis stood as Wade's best man, while Mrs. Abernathy from the hotel had insisted on being Ruby's matron of honor. When the music began and Ruby walked down the aisle, she had eyes only for Wade. He stood tall at the altar, looking more handsome than ever in a new suit, his face transformed by a smile that outshone the sunlight streaming through the stained glass. Their vows were simple but heartfelt. Wade's voice was steady as he promised to cherish, protect, and love her all the days of his life. Ruby's voice trembled only slightly as she pledged herself to him in return. I now pronounce you man and wife, the preacher declared. You may kiss your bride. Wade lifted her veil with gentle hands. Hello, Mrs. Xander, he whispered before claiming her lips in a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. The celebration afterwards spilled from the church to the town square, where tables groaned with food contributed by everyone in Copper Creek. There was dancing and laughter long into the evening, and when Wade finally swept Ruby into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their new home, a small cabin he'd spent weeks renovating on the edge of town, she felt a happiness so complete it brought tears to her eyes. Welcome home, wife, Wade said, setting her gently on her feet in their front room. Ruby looked around at the simple but comfortable furnishings, the curtains she'd sewn herself, the photographs of Wade's parents alongside the single daguerreotype she'd managed to save of her own. It's perfect, she whispered, turning into his embrace. Everything is perfect. Later, as they lay tangled in each other's arms, the moonlight spilling through the window to paint silver patterns on their skin, Ruby traced the scar on Wade's chest from Fletcher's knife. Any regrets? She asked softly. About settling down? Giving up the trail? Wade caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. Not a single one. The only trail I'm interested in now is the one we're making together. Sheriff Davis mentioned another case, Ruby said carefully. A stagecoach robbery near Phoenix. Wade nodded.
He did.
Asked if I'd consult, help them identify the gang. He studied her face. Would it bother you if I helped occasionally? Ruby smiled, curling closer to his warmth. I fell in love with all of you, Wade Xander. Your need to help people, to make things right, that's part of who you are. She pressed a kiss to his shoulder. Just promise you'll always come home to me. That's the easiest promise I'll ever make, he assured her, gathering her closer. You are my home, Ruby. Have been since the moment I found you. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. Copper Creek grew from a mining camp to a proper town with a school, a bank, and a newspaper. Wade became Sheriff Davis's right-hand man and eventual successor when the older man retired. Ruby took over Mrs. Turner's shop entirely when the old woman's eyesight failed completely, renaming it Preston and Xander Fine Tailoring, and expanding to include men's clothing as well as women's. Their family grew too. William Xander arrived in their second year of marriage, a sturdy boy with his father's blue-gray eyes and his mother's determination. Rose followed 2 years later, a tiny girl with auburn curls and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. Wade still occasionally helped track fugitives, but never strayed far from Copper Creek. His reputation alone was often enough to bring surrenders without violence. Ruby's nightmares about chains and abandonment faded with time, replaced by dreams of the future they were building together. On the 5th anniversary of the day Wade found Ruby in the desert, they closed their respective businesses early and rode out of town. Wade led them to a familiar rocky overhang where they'd spent their first night together. "Recognize it?" he asked as he helped her down from her horse. Ruby nodded, looking around at the landscape that had once seemed so hostile but now felt almost welcoming. "Our first camp." Wade spread a blanket on the ground, then unpacked a picnic from his saddlebags. As they ate, they watched the sun begin its descent, painting the desert in the same violent hues Ruby had seen that fateful evening. "I was dying when you found me," Ruby said quietly, leaning against his shoulder. "Not just my body. My spirit was broken. I'd given up hope." Wade's arm tightened around her. "And now?" Ruby smiled, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. "Now I have everything I never dared to hope for. A home. A family." She turned to face him. A love strong enough to break chains. Wade cupped her face in hands that had grown slightly softer over the years of town living, though they still bore the calluses of hard work. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Ruby Xander. You saved me as much as I saved you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, they held each other close, whispering promises for the next 5 years, and the 5 after that, and all the years to come. From tragedy to triumph, from chains to freedom, from strangers to lovers, their journey had only just begun. And in the vast Arizona wilderness where their story started, they sealed their future with a kiss that held all the strength and tenderness of chains broken by bare hands and a woman carried to safety in loving arms. 10 years later, Copper Creek had transformed from a rough mining town to a respectable stop on the railroad line. The discovery of silver in the surrounding mountains had brought renewed prosperity, and with it, more families seeking stability and opportunity. Wade and Ruby Xander had become pillars of the community. Wade's tenure as sheriff had brought law and order to a once wild town, while Ruby's tailoring business had expanded to include a dress shop that rivaled anything in Tucson or Phoenix. Their home, once a simple cabin, had grown with their family and success, now a handsome 2-story house on what had become one of the town's most desirable streets. William, now 15, had his father's height and his mother's gentle spirit. He worked alongside Wade whenever school allowed, learning tracking and marksmanship while developing a thoughtful nature that served him well as the sheriff's son. 13-year-old Rose had blossomed into a beauty with her mother's auburn hair and her father's penetrating gaze, displaying a talent for numbers that had the bank manager already hinting at a position when she was older. And 8-year-old twins James and Julia, surprises who had arrived just as Ruby and Wade had thought their family complete, brought constant energy and laughter to the Xander household. It was a warm summer evening, and the family had gathered on their wide front porch after supper. Wade sat in his favorite rocking chair, watching his children play a game of checkers while Ruby mended one of William's shirts beside him. "I never thought I'd have this," Wade said softly, his voice meant only for his wife's ears. Ruby looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. Even after 15 years of marriage, her heart still quickened at the tenderness in his gaze. "Have what?" Wade gestured to the scene before them, their children laughing, their home solid and welcoming, the town spread out below them peaceful in the gathering dusk. All of this. A life worth living. A legacy worth leaving. Ruby set aside her mending and reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his as naturally as breathing. The small scar on her wrist had faded to a silvery line, visible only if you knew to look for it. "We built it together," she reminded him. "One day at a time." Their moment was interrupted by William, who had been keeping watch down the road.
"Bah!"
"Riders coming." Wade was on his feet instantly, his hand moving automatically to the gun he still wore, even in retirement from active law enforcement. He relaxed slightly as he recognized the lead rider as Deputy Collins, the young man who had taken over much of the sheriff's duties as Wade transitioned to a more advisory role. "Evening, Sheriff," Collins called as he reined in his horse. Two other deputies flanked him, all looking dusty and tired. "Sorry to disturb your family time." "What is it, Collins?" Wade asked, stepping down from the porch. "Got word from the telegraph office," Collins replied, his expression grim. "Silas Crawley's been spotted in Bisbee, recognized by a drummer who knew him from back east." Ruby gasped, the name hitting her like a physical blow. 15 years had passed since Crawley had left her chained in the desert to die, but the memory had never fully faded. Wade's face hardened. "Crawley," he said, the name like poison on his tongue. "You're certain?" Collins nodded. "Description matches. Got that scar through his eyebrow, just like you said. He's going by the name Samuel Carson now, running a freighting business." Wade turned to Ruby, a silent question in his eyes. After all these years, Crawley's crimes, robbery, attempted murder, and the murder of Martin Walsh that Ruby had witnessed remained unpunished. Ruby stood, her back straight, her voice steady. "He needs to face justice, Wade. For Martin.
For what he did to me.
For all the others he likely robbed or worse over the years." Wade nodded once, a decision made. "William," he called to his son, "go fetch my saddlebags from the storage room. The ones I keep packed." William hesitated, looking between his parents. "You're leaving? Tonight?" "No," Wade said firmly. "Not tonight. We'll leave at first light. This has waited 15 years. It can wait until morning." He turned back to Collins. "Tell Marshal Stevens I'll be in Bisbee within 3 days. Have him keep an eye on Crawley, but don't approach him. Man's dangerous when cornered." As the deputies rode away, Ruby followed Wade into the house. Their children, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained quietly on the porch. "You don't have to go," Wade said once they were alone in their bedroom. "Crawley doesn't know you're alive. Doesn't know you're here." Ruby shook her head. "I need to go. Need to look him in the eye when they put him in chains." She touched the scar on her wrist. "Need to close that chapter for good." Wade drew her into his arms, his embrace as solid and reassuring as it had been that first night. "Then we go together, as we've done everything else." The following morning, after arrangements were made for the children to stay with Mrs. Turner, now nearly blind but still sharp as a tack at 84, Wade and Ruby mounted their horses for the journey to Bisbee. William had begged to come along, but Wade had been firm. "Your job is to look after your sisters and brother," he told his son. "This is old business, from before you were born. Your mother and I need to settle it ourselves." The 3-day ride to Bisbee was uneventful, giving Ruby too much time to think, to remember. The helplessness of being chained. The thirst. The certainty of death approaching with each passing hour. And then Wade, silhouetted against the setting sun, breaking her chains with nothing but his bare hands and the strength of his will. "What are you thinking?" Wade asked on their final night on the trail, as they sat beside a small fire. Ruby looked up from the flames. "About chains," she said honestly. "About how some bind the body, and others bind the soul." Wade's eyes, still as clear and penetrating as the day they met, studied her face. "And which kind are we riding toward?" "I don't know," Ruby admitted. "But I know we need to break them, whatever they are." They arrived in Bisbee the following afternoon, dusty and tired but resolute. Marshal Stevens met them at his office, a burly man with a drooping mustache and intelligent eyes. "He's still here," Stevens confirmed. "Carson, or Crawley as you know him, runs a legitimate business far as anyone can tell. Married, 2 young children. Wife doesn't seem to know about his past." Ruby felt a flicker of unease. "Children?" Stevens nodded. "Boy about 7, girl maybe 4 or 5. Wade and Ruby exchanged a look, the same thought crossing their minds. Innocent children who would suffer for their father's crimes. "We're not here to punish his family," Wade said finally. "Just to bring him to justice." "How do you want to handle this?" Stevens asked. "Man's well-liked in town. Got connections." Wade considered. Better to take him quiet, away from his family and friends. Less chance of someone getting hurt. They formulated a plan. Crawley made regular runs to Tucson, often traveling alone ahead of his freight wagons. They would intercept him on the trail the following morning, before he reached the open desert where he might spot them approaching. That night, in the small hotel room they'd taken, Ruby lay awake long after Wade's breathing had deepened into sleep. The thought of confronting Crawley brought back the terror of those days in chains, but also a resolve she hadn't anticipated. She had survived, had thrived. While Crawley had been hiding from his past, Ruby had been building a future. At dawn, they positioned themselves at a bend in the road 2 miles outside Bisbee. Marshal Stevens and 2 deputies were hidden further back, ready if things went wrong. Wade and Ruby waited in the shelter of a rocky outcropping, their horses ground-tied nearby. "You don't have to do this," Wade said one last time. "Could stay back with Stevens." Ruby shook her head. "I need to see his face when he realizes who I am, that I lived." They didn't wait long. The sound of an approaching wagon reached them just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. Wade squeezed Ruby's hand once, then moved into position on the other side of the road. Silas Crawley had aged in the 15 years since Ruby had last seen him. His beard was streaked with gray, and he'd grown heavier, but the scar through his eyebrow was unmistakable. He drove his wagon with casual confidence, humming a tune that carried on the still morning air. Wade stepped into the road, his hand raised. "Morning, Mr. Carson," he called, using the name Crawley had adopted. "Need a word with you." Crawley reined in his team, squinting at Wade. "Do I know you, mister?" "No," Wade replied evenly. "But my wife knows you. Knew you as Silas Crawley, not Samuel Carson." Confusion crossed Crawley's face, followed by the first flicker of alarm. His hand moved toward his coat, where a bulge suggested a concealed weapon. "I wouldn't," Wade warned, his own hand hovering near his gun. "Marshal Stevens and his deputies are just down the road. This ends peacefully or not, but it ends today." Ruby stepped out from behind the rocks, moving to stand beside Wade. "Hello, Silas," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Remember me?" Crawley stared, his face draining of color. "You're dead," he whispered. "Left you chained. No one could have survived that." "Someone found me," Ruby said simply. "Broke those chains with his bare hands and carried me to safety." She slipped her hand into Wade's. "My husband." Crawley's eyes darted between them, calculating his chances. With a sudden movement, he reached for his gun, but Wade was faster. A A single shot rang out, and Crawley howled as the bullet struck his shoulder, sending his weapon flying into the dust. Marshal Stevens and his deputies appeared, surrounding the wagon with weapons drawn. As they pulled Crawley down and cuffed him, the man's bravado crumbled. "My family," he pleaded, looking at Ruby. "My children. They don't know. They're innocent." Ruby approached him, standing close enough to see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she had felt as he rode away, leaving her to die. "I'll speak to your wife," she said quietly. "Tell her what happened. Not to punish you, but because she deserves the truth." Crawley's head dropped in defeat. "I've changed," he mumbled. "Been a good husband, a good father." "Maybe you have," Wade said, coming to stand beside Ruby. "But Martin Walsh never got the chance to be either. The judge will take that into account, along with everything else." As Stevens and his deputies led Crawley away, Ruby felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a chain she hadn't realized she still carried, finally broken. "What now?" Wade asked, his arms sliding around her waist. Ruby leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence, as she had for 15 years. "Now we go home," she said. "To our children. Our life. No regrets." Ruby shook her head. "The chains are broken. All of them. Finally." They returned to Copper Creek 3 days later, their children running to meet them as they rode down the main street. William, tall and serious, trying not to show his relief. Rose, practically dancing with excitement to share all that had happened in their absence. The twins, James and Julia, demanding simultaneous hugs that left Wade and Ruby laughing. That night, after the children were asleep, Wade found Ruby standing on their porch, gazing up at the star-filled sky. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Ruby leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I was thinking about chains," she replied. "About how sometimes the strongest ones are invisible." Wade's arms tightened. "And are yours broken now? Truly?" Ruby turned in his embrace, reaching up to trace the lines that 15 years had etched around his eyes, lines of laughter, of worry, of a life fully lived. "They were broken the moment you found me," she said softly. "Everything since has just been learning to believe it." Wade kissed her then, with all the tenderness and passion that had sustained them through 15 years of building a life from the ashes of her near destruction. When they parted, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you, Ruby Xander," he whispered, the words as fresh and true as the first time he'd spoken them. "And I love you, Wade Xander," she replied, her heart full to bursting. "My rescuer. My husband. My home." As they stood together under the vast Arizona sky, Ruby knew with absolute certainty that no chains, physical or spiritual, could ever bind her again. Not when she had the love of the man who had broken them with his bare hands and carried her to safety, not just once in the desert long ago, but every day since, in 1,000 small ways that added up to a life redeemed and gloriously, wonderfully free.